right. Welcome, everybody, to this Thesis Theater for Signum University, and I'm delighted to present to you today Jay Moses. And let me just tell you a little bit about Jay before we get any further. He's a pastor at St. Mark Presbyterian Church in the DC area, teaching adjunct at the University of Maryland. His favourite memories leading to his studies at Signum are finding yellow worn paperbacks of Ray Bradbury in his sister's bookshelf, watching The Hobbit with cheese popcorn made by his mother. I've never had cheese popcorn. To a British person, that sounds very strange.
Good.
And listening to the many ghost stories told by his father while camping. His wife is the best thing about him. I have no arguments to make here. And his children...
Go ahead, yeah.
His children continue to wonder if he really reads his books. I have no comment to make there either. So welcome, Jay. Welcome all to your Thesis Theater. We're going to start off by I'm going to ask Jay, could you tell us a little bit about your thesis?
All right. Well, I happened to think you were going to ask me that, and I prepared a PowerPoint presentation.
Is there something you prepared a little earlier?
I just happened to have prepared something thinking that might be asked of me tonight. So let's see if it comes up. Look at that. Yeah, so I thought it would be really great to be able to graduate with a master's doing in some form of a ghost story, in the literature of ghost stories. So whether folks know it or not, M.R. James is one of the most famous turn-of-the-century ghost story writers in England, and began that study of M.R. James first, and then it kind of focused out a little bit into the folk horror genre that he has for a guy who's, almost a century old of his death. He's got a lot of modern play amongst scholars of the genre of folk horror. So, and then in studying that, it narrowed down into several of his stories that focused on 17th century England. So the beginning of folk horror, which I'll talk a little bit about, is kind of an English thing. Even though it exists in every culture, it's kind of an English thing. So anyway, so you can move the slide, Dr. Brown. Okay, that's me on the top right there, last week's sermon. It went really well. But the birth of the term folk horror, or the genre itself, it's very recent. Piers Haggard was the producer of The Blood on Satan's Claw in 1971. And in an interview in 2003, he used the term folk horror to describe a series of films that were made in the 70s within, if I may say, Britain, or Great Britain, if you're going to allow me to say that. And it distinguished itself from just like fairy tales or dark fairy tales or things like that, being folk horror, as connected to what they call the unholy trinity. The unholy trinity are three films that came out the late 60s and early 70s that are linked together in people's memories and created some traction as far as a different genre of horror. The first was The Witchfinder General with, I don't know if he is, well, he's American, so he can't be knighted, can he? But Vincent Price certainly should be knighted in Great Britain. But he did The Witchfinder General, which was the first film that kind of got this genre going. And then The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971, has to do with a lot of occult type situations going on there. And then I would hope some people out there have watched The Wicker Man, which is one of my favorite films. But the three of these films got linked together in people's memories. And I'll throw this in, Dr. Brown, because I tend to bring up Doctor Who all the time. But in the mid-70s, in John Pertwee's era and Tom Baker's, about 73 to 75, there just was a lot of folk horror type media being produced in England. And, we're kind of like tablets or, blank slates that get impressed upon by what we see in or around. And so folks connected and remembered that genre of kind of a rural type of horror and in the 2000s started trying to mimic it in media and also to explore it critically. So there's quite a bit of literature out there now on folk horror, quite a bit of anthologies of short stories of folk horror, and quite a few authors or folks in media that you'll recognize. I'll mention here at the end here. But Adam Scoville's a scholar of folk horror, and he has linked like what are the common themes or patterns in folk horror. And so the main thing is the landscape, right? So folk horror typically, and it doesn't always, but for the majority of the time, it's about the western, you guys are gonna have to correct me here, the eastern shore of Maryland. Or is it the western shore? It's that place, those places in the regions where we live. Is it Wales, Dr. Brown? I'm not sure, part of Wales, where we kind of go a little faster. We're a little nervous. Salinas in California, I'm thinking of someplace out near West Chicago, a little farther east in Chicago. But its main focus, if you're telling a ghost story and it's out in the woods somewhere, that's the beginning of folk horror. And so the media itself has a lot to do with filming of meadows. Again, it began, as all good things do, the Beatles and Tolkien and all those things, right? The Kinks as well. But the good things start in England, and so many of these original movies were of the English meadows and the forests, the rural parts of England. And of course, England it's much older than the United States. We'd like to think we are much older, but they are much older than we are. There's layers of culture there and layers of civilization there and layers of conflict there that can bring forth some eerie things. So the first thing is there's a lot of detail given to the landscape in folk horror. And a lot of time, I don't mean to scare anybody here, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is folk horror. Again, being out in a rural place where there's agricultural things happening that you don't usually associate with being in the city. So let's see here, I'm getting comments, I'm getting distracted. So the landscape's really important. The next thing, you find yourself out in eastern Chicago, out in the west Chicago, out towards far out there, is isolation. That if the movies where you go out far, far, far in a cabin somewhere, something bad's going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And folk horror is the understanding that there are some things that have been preserved by their isolation. So folk horror is all about, like in the Wicker Man, you go off into some island that nobody ever goes to in the North Sea, and you find this really bizarre group of cult-like people living there doing things that are strange and distorted versions of what you understand to be mainstream. So that brings up the third thing that's a part of folk horror is the folk themselves, or the people. So folk horror, many times, if you're to throw this out there, Children of the Corn, right? If you've read the book by Stephen King, you kind of run into some different belief systems out there in the cornfields with the kids, right? I know there's a lot of teachers, my wife being one of them, that would say Children of the Corn is still occurring in our day in local schools. But you go out there and you got kids that are killing people, or they got a skewed view of morality, but they've been isolated, and they've been led by a charismatic leader who has kind of been the focal point of leading this group into different views. And then the last thing is there's a summoning of some sort, right? There's a summoning of some sort that happens within the story where some evil finally gets uncovered, right? So if we talk about the Blair Witch Project, a little bit more recent, it's at the end where they go into that spooky house, and the witch obviously is there somehow. There's a summoning of evil that gets unveiled to those who have unfortunately run into this region. So folk horror is always about kind of the forgotten folk, the people who lived here before we did, right? the person that is in your house that still lives here, you thought they moved out, but they live in the basement, and that's what that creek is. That's kind of folk horror. There was someone here before, and there are regions, landscapes that preserve memory or remnants of that people group that you thought was gone. So I just thought Nathaniel Hawthorne, to be American here, Sleepy Hollow is a great example of early American folk horror, even though that term didn't get developed till recently. But Sleepy Hollow has got this really, all this kind of stuff from the American Revolution underneath it, and stories of the native population, and that's what gets Ichabod Crane in so much trouble. He kind of wanders into a whole nother situation that he thought, because he's an enlightened person, doesn't exist anymore. But that's where the Headless Horseman comes in. Stephen King's novels, all of his stories are written in Maine. I believe Bernie Sanders is also in Maine, which I'm not sure if that's relevant or not. But Stephen King's Maine, there's all this stuff underneath his stories. They're all about, like with Pet Sematary again, that there was an Indian burial ground. That's a real stereotype, but anyway, it's an American one. But there's people that lived here before we did. There are different knowledges, witchcraft, occult things that remain. I thought of this the other day, but in America, you might want to think of the haunted South, right? The Confederacy, I would like to think is defeated, or still needs to be fully, but you go into the South and you see remnants of the Confederacy, right? You see remnants of a people that don't exist anymore, but as we have found out in America, there are pockets that are still around. So what's it called? The zombie show, it is The Walking Dead is a good example of folk horror. You're in the South, you've got that haunted feeling of the people who were defeated, but they hang on. And the zombies kind of represent the South in some ways. And then I couldn't help but put Crystal Lake. I have a framed picture of Crystal Lake in the house right now that I only take out during Halloween. But Crystal Lake has got all this, it's like from Friday the 13th, but it's got all this stories of things that happened up on the hill, and then they're all up in the camp and the stuff's happening. So it's this forgotten folk, right? And I hate to be a spoiler, but Friday the 13th, it's the mother who's been hanging out there and raising her son. And there's these weird countercultural characters that still live there. The last one there at the bottom, I think I mentioned most of those modern examples of folk horror, but True Detective, which I think is on HBO Max. It's in its 4th season, but it is a great example of folk horror. I would start at season 3, although Jodie Foster's in season 4, and really you have to watch anything Jodie Foster does. But it's all about Jodie Foster in the 4th season is in Alaska. So it's not, in continental America. It's just that every place, there's always a people before people. And there's always this remnant that we fear might still be around that don't like that we took over and have a different set of beliefs than we do. All right, Professor Brown, you can switch the slide. And I'll move right along here. So Montague Rhodes James was kind of a turn of the century Englishman. He was the son of a clergyman, a Church of English clergyman. His brother was a clergyman. So he was in that kind of religious backdrop of England, and a real academic, like most folks we read about in that era. You want to talk about C.S. Lewis, you want to talk about Tolkien, you want to talk, who went through the English system of learning and then just kept going, remained single his whole life. He was a medievalist, so there's some ties to Tolkien here a little bit, or to Signum as far as all things medieval. But he was a scholar of antiquarian interests. So he would go throughout the entire English countryside on his bicycle and visit these old, like Norman churches, these really old churches. And he would categorize the stained glass, how old they were. He would find the manuscripts that had been left there by monks because, he would go into these abbeys that had been shut down by Henry VIII. And he would find all this ancient stuff and transcribe it and categorize it. And really, if you're into medieval literature at all, you still find him really from the work he did there. He's a scholar in his own right. You still hear about him. And he became a New Testament scholar in that he translated and found a lot of the apocryphal, the pseudepigrapha is what we would call it, but they're the parts of the Bible that we hear about every 2 years, that they're the secret parts that nobody knows. But these were like, the Apocalypse of Peter or the Gospel of Solomon, or, whatever. They were just old, kind of dark stories that didn't make it into the canon of the New Testament. And many of his kind of demonic scenarios in his short stories have a backdrop of a lot of these apocryphal stories that he was a master of. And again, if you read these stories, if you look for them in English translation, you will still find M.R. James in the footnotes, that he was one of the original people who found the copies and translated them and categorized them so we could find them. But he was in Cambridge, and like most things, right, Tolkien just kind of started scribbling on the back of a notepad with a job he had to do to go to vacation with his kids. On Christmas Eves, M.R. James decided he was just going to tell stories for the students there to kind of spook them out in an English kind of way, right? So he's very straight, he showed a little bit of emotion. It was a big deal. But he told all these ghost stories that you read about. Maybe if you go from here, you just pick up a $10 copy of his best ghost stories. They were all read orally, so you can tell that by reading them. They have a real rhythm to them. He told them orally to the students who came. And so you will find a great deal of scholarship that root like a Pet Cemetery, or more recently Witch, right? Or A Field in England. And they will talk about M.R. James in a way that they don't talk about any other ghost story writer of the turn of the century. So he links in there with folk horror, and that was kind of part of the thesis here, is why that was so, right? So you can do the next slide there, Professor Brown. There we are. So M.R. James's secret vice, I'm sorry, I keep leaking in Tolkien, but I think it's appropriate. His secret vice was languages. M.R. James's secret vice was he loved the 17th century. So he would go around to abbeys and just these shut down places in the rural eastern countryside of England. And he would dig up the records of court cases and all this stuff in the 17th century. He would write to his colleagues that this was the really good stuff. This is what he really liked the most, right? He loved that time period. And again, his father was a rector in a very rural folk horrorish part of East Anglia, which was not modernized the way the rest of England became. And within these records, there's just, within the 17th century, you've got the English Civil Wars, you've got the witch trials, you've got just persecution of just about everybody. And so M.R. James, above all, loved detective novels, and he loved reading court records. And so in many ways, the stories that I read are kind of they're like historical fiction in some ways. That time period of the dislocation of England at that time fed into kind of the paranoia that folk horror is about, that you can't quite trust the neighbor down the road or really know where he is right now. So the 4 stories that I chose, there could have been probably 2 more, but the ones that I thought fit it the best were his most famous story, The Ash Tree, which is in a lot of horror collections, Martin's Close, The Rose Garden, and The Fenstanton Witch. The Ash Tree and The Fenstanton Witch deal with witchcraft and the persecution of the witch trials. The Rose Garden and Martin's Close have more to do with persecution of Roman Catholics during the Popish plots and kind of class warfare during the 17th century, that kind of this sectarian milieu, I guess you could call it, of the 17th century. So those are the 4 stories that I kind of did a close reading of. So you can turn the next slide. So I think I mentioned this a little bit, and I won't belabor the point here, but 17th century England, besides having these scary contraptions on the slide and spooky looking people that you don't want coming to your door, there was a revival of the witch hunts in the 17th century, where charismatic leaders like Matthew Hopkins, the original witch finder general, would just come into your neighborhood and offer his services for a fee to scapegoat someone in your neighborhood, and then you would hang him or her. Well, the majority of people who were hung in the witch trials were women. And elderly women, elderly single women. So anyway, we could get into all that. And then the sectarian milieu, because of the splintering of the parliament and the monarchy of King Charles at the time, people were at each other's throats. They didn't know who was standing for what. And so you just had a real paranoia and a breaking up of the land as far as there were pockets. I mean, it's just like now we're just on the eve of the elections. You got these pockets of red, pockets of green. There are no pockets of green at all. I am the pocket of green. Pockets of blue. And 17th century, you just had a real tenseness of civil war that had broken out in England. So a great deal of paranoia and violence that was happening. Within this time frame, there's also the rise of the Puritan movement. And to not belabor the point, but the Puritans, at least for James and in the writings, the stories, they kind of blended kind of a theocratic understanding of governance that, you know, you had all these judges that were at Parliament, but then they used the Bible to kind of make sure that they proved their point. That witches had to exist. You could try someone for being a witch. This is after the Enlightenment, remember, okay? Because it was in the Bible, and the Bible had to be true and infallible and all that kind of stuff. So the rise of theocracy was a fear for a lot of people, as it is today, where, you know, what is that? The Handmaid's Tale, where theocratic governance comes on and uses kind of, I don't know, biblical ideology that not everybody's on board with. That was in the mix there. So a lot of the characters that are the scary ones in James's stories that I read were, you know, more religious type folks. I could make a joke about that. Anyway, and then the fearful norm as you had these judges that went out into the countryside during the Civil War. And if there was an uprising, they'd send them out and they would just do kind of like off the grid judgments on half the population. And, you know, you would go down the street and see just, you know, hanging after hanging after hanging. And so there was just a great deal of memory in the English memory of this being a bloody time, the bloody civil wars. And then, as I said, the eerie English landscape, everybody loves England. It's the setting of so much. It's got a long history of different types of governance and people. And I suppose folk horror is when the leaves bleed and speak of the past to you and warn you. So that's kind of the eeriness of the folk horror of the English. It reminds you of a century that is unfortunately relevant still today. So it feeds on fears. So those are the seeds of the 17th century that I think fed into M.R. James's stories that he loved and why his stories fed into folk horror today. And I think there's one more slide. Yeah, that's me. That's a live picture of me on the left there. We just got a new dog, so that's kind of what he looks like. No, look, the difference between entertainment entertainment is just a good old story like there. That's M.R. James on the left, and you got like some sort of demon coming behind him. And that's scary and entertaining. We got movies about that. That's fine. But folk horror is a statement, is a social statement about today. Folk horror is a warning that there are pockets of unease in the culture, and that there are folks with different beliefs than you do that you thought were gone, but all of a sudden they're in charge. So there's a socio-political angle to folk horror that is not just in horror itself, which many times can just be for entertainment. So that was, since you asked, Professor Brown, those were the random thoughts I had on this, on my thesis and the slides. So that would be my answer to your question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. And I will just dispense with the slides so that you can be full screen in all your glory. All right, well, thank you very much for doing that. And attendees, please do feel free to put any questions that you have into the Q&A box. I will be getting to them at some point during this Thesis Theatre. But before I go to audience questions, Jay, can you tell us a little bit about how and why you chose this particular topic? Why this one?
I really felt it would be cool to get a degree in ghost stories. My upbringing was in the late 70s, the mid 70s. So I remember all those weird folk Hammer horror shows and bizarre Doctor Who episodes, and just the violent folk horror that was in that time period. So it's kind of a part of my upbringing. I think I was raised in a, I don't want to say a cult, but a small religious community where I think we were viewed as the folk people that area. So I think I related in that sense to what it's like to be kind of a minority that's thought of as backward. And then my father, so I guess if my dad's a pastor and I lived in a cult, he was the cult leader, just to throw that out to him. But he took us out camping all the time out in the woods and would tell ghost stories. And they tended to be, you know, they're about being out in the woods somewhere. And that just made an impression on me. I happen to be a pastor. Pastors, I would hope, happen to be drawn to the line between evil and good. That's
Mm-hmm.
what we're preoccupied by. And folk horror kind of encapsulates that. M.R. James was very interested in the results of those trials and wrote folk horror over the issues of justice, right? And appropriate punishment and all that kind of stuff. So he was working through issues of good and bad as well. So that's my excuse for doing all this work about weird things.
Okay, thanks. There's a few things popping up in the Q&A. Robert Cathy has a point for you. He says, Jay, one other anthropological approach to some of these issues is a work by Walter Burkett, Homo Nicans, The Anthropology of Ancient Greek Sacrificial Ritual and Myth, which is a work cited in Vampire Studies.
Well, that's good to know. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
I read that to get to bed at night. It helps me get to sleep.
You
So
missed
thank you.
Jay. You
Yes.
could have bring in Vampire and Ghost Studies.
Sure. Yeah. That's true. That's true. I could have gone
Anyway,
that way.
so that's a work for you to
Okay.
to consider at some point. All right, but he also has a question for you. He says, what about the crossover from folk horror to non-fiction journalism? He's thinking particularly about Lawrence Wright's Remembering Satan, a tragic case of recovered memory, or 48 Hours, which was on CBS, which recounts true crime stories using folk horror tropes. And what about how Wright demythologizes the beliefs about Satan using anthropology in Remembering Satan? Psychology and social psychology are used by Wright to question the folk horror beliefs of the Pentecostal Christians in Olympia, Washington, which was a court case covered by Wright for the New Yorker.
Now, first of all, that's his last question, Professor Brown. He's no longer able to ask a question. But yeah, I mean, it bleeds over into real life, right? I mean, where we see this all around, where you hear these cases and they feed into fear, folk fear that there are people not like us that live in a modern society and have beliefs that we think aren't worth believing in, like whatever, the demonic stuff, or I mean, that was big in the late 80s as far as some of those things that came out in the news. So there's always a crossover. I mean, folk horror is a little bit more serious than entertainment horror in that it leads into real life. This is happening, right? It could have been a real story, because the fear in folk horror is not the existence of witches. It's the fear of people who believe in witches, right? It's the community. It's the community that believes countercultural things that is what creates the fear. And we certainly have plenty of that in this world, and especially in America. So that would be my answer to Bob, who has now used up his question.
I'm only assuming that you know.
I know Bob very well. Bob has done great things for me. He's a wonderful man.
Okay, thank you. So I just would like to ask you, what is it that you have found to be the strongest thread between folk horror and James's stories?
So I think James, his love of the outdoors, and he was outdoors often, and he had a wonderful way of writing about geography. He's a geography writer. And so because he wrote with such detail, the depth the depth of his, I don't want to call it secondary worlds, but it just depends on what you want to call it. His
Hmm.
stories have great depth because he really writes landscape well, because he grew up in a more rural kind of folkish place where all these stories were, and he knew people like this. So folk horror is all about setting. It's all about being isolated and the folklore around you and the fear of the forest. And M.R. James wrote powerfully in a unique way amongst his peers of the geography. He was a wonderful geography writer. And then the other thing is he had a love of trying to preserve or mimic or demean um, lower class people, or who he thought he attempted in most of his stories to create characters that spoke a blunt vernacular, and he would try and do it phonetically, but folk horror, you know what I mean? What is the name of that movie with Burt Reynolds and they go down the river and then they run into some guys and you should
Deliverance?
Deliverance, you did not want to run into those people, right? That's not a
Not
good
so much.
idea. And they had accents and they were really like, it was like you thought you were way out in the middle of nowhere and you're in trouble. M.R. James went out of his way to try and recreate the difference of different marginalized communities.
Hmm.
You've got huntsmen and people who, are doing the yard or hunting or whatever. I just said that, but their vernacular, he changes his whole gear of how to phonetically write what a marginalized person might speak like.
Hmm.
So in folk horror, if you watch those movies, or that's always a part of it. Is this is a really backwoods type situation? They speak differently than you do. They don't speak like you do, and M.R. James went out of his way for whatever reason to really make that class distinction in his writing.
Is that part of the way in which he was othering them to make them
Yes.
even more creepy to the reader?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could just say, well, unfortunately, I wonder if he saw people this way. Yeah, I mean, you can get all psychological. It's not an ethic to do in life, but he definitely was othering them. But he was in this rural part of East Anglia, and
Hmm.
folks talked in this vernacular where he grew up, and so it really made an impression on him to try and capture that in his writing. It was really a part of him to try and recreate the characters in the woods that would come to church, or would just be in the neighborhood. It was a part of his background.
Okay, thank you. We've got some more questions from our lovely audience. Emmy Lowe says, can you talk more about one of the stories that you read and how it particularly fits into the folk horror genre and deals with the unrest in 17th century England? So kind of, the which one of them did you find most interesting and how does it fit into Emmy's question?
Emmy's my niece, so she's definitely barred from asking another question. Okay,
I
she's damn smart too. But
love the way you're using that to give yourself a beat of time to think. That's very.
yeah, no. Well, I liked the ones that had to do with witchcraft, the witch trials. Um,
Mhm.
so that is um, the Fenstanton Witch, and I'm forgetting the name of the other one. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do that or not, but it is the ash tree.
Yeah.
But the Fenstanton Witch, I really liked, Emmy, because it talked about how the interaction in the countryside of folks who were called to keep order, but they would give in to the folk people and dunk people they deemed as witches, and of course they were just women that were, that they just, it was horrible. And again, his writing of the geography of going out in the fields and finding Norman churches, which is old churches that have been kind of reconstructed. They're ancient. That was a story I really thought had a real folk horror vibe to it, as far as going out in the English countryside. And as these two priests are going out in the countryside, he sees victims of what has got to be the Civil War coming the other way, but they're
Mhm.
being led by demons and spirits. But it's really a snapshot of that. And then, and a really good one, Emmy, because now I will send you the book that I have read. But the Martin's Close is all about class distinction in the Civil War, and how, you know, folks got marginalized at the bottom. There wasn't a middle class, and you've got the aristocracy and people who were learned from the Enlightenment and people who never left their towns. That really, with folk studies, a lot of folks in England never left their towns. Even in the 1930s, you know, folks were doing these folklore studies and finding folks who had these old stuff. So those two stories I liked, or I think have relevance to the 17th century, that are easy to kind of comprehend.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And another question for you from Max Grossman. And Max says, to the extent that folk horror thrives on a modern existence overlaid on a backward past time, what is the folk horror of the contemporary US suburb? Not necessarily Blair Witch, but is there actually a folk horror opportunity in the suburbs?
See, now, she is a professor at the University of Maryland who has hired me to teach there.
Ah, in that case,
So I am certainly on the grill now. No, I mean, we are living in America. Like Max, I haven't gone up to wherever it is in Maryland. It's more rural, the Eastern Shore, up as you go west. There are folks up there that I don't know we're going to have a lot in common. When I lived in Chicago, up in Wisconsin, we had all the neo-Nazis come down to Skokie. And we're trying to figure out how these people even existed anymore. There are pockets, as January 6th has shown us in America, that this is not a minor phenomenon. Again, folk horror is talking about it. It's not just for entertainment. It is a warning of where society is at. So I can't get any more political than that, because there's folks on different sides. My dad's on this. I can't talk about, but only to say that when I go down to the National Mall and I go to the House of Representatives where my daughter works, and there's a certain party that has dominance at the House of Representatives, I feel like a total stranger when I walk in there. And I feel like there are, if I may say Marjorie Taylor Greene, if I may say a name, there are things coming out of a subculture that doesn't go away. That's the whole part of folk horror. It doesn't go away. You think it should go away because we're all rational people. But folk horror says, no, 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 there's no equal rationality. You gotta survive somehow. So those would be my attempts at saying something quasi-political.
Okay. Okay, so Max would just like to let you know that this is Jay's second interview.
Okay. Well, as Ringo said, I hope I passed the audition, right?
Well, I'm sure she will let you know. All right, we have another question from Carl Kaufman. And Carl asks, are Edgar Allan Poe's stories in the folk horror vein? And does it look to you like they might have influenced James?
Poe influenced everybody. He's a giant. He influenced everybody. Anybody that did any kind of horror or suspense writing. Yes and no. Yes and no. Poe didn't go out of his way to talk about rurality so much. You know, I mean, things were just rural in general there, and he lived in towns, and his folks get caught in different places that are within the town. So he's huge and influenced everybody, but he's certainly in there, but he doesn't get mentioned in or canon. No.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to me that Poe really focuses on the folk, as it were, so much as he focuses on particular characters in the moment. It's not so much the idea of the folk and what's going on for them that's bringing the horror. I don't know. What do you think?
Poe is psychological horror. How's that? Poe is the horror is making your blood rise and you're getting nervous, but it's just in your head. It's Gothic, right? It's Gothic.
It is very
closer relations to Gothic than to folk horror. Let's do that. And so there's just that things are getting hotter in the room and it's getting smaller and you're getting paranoid, and that's Poe. But folk horror is talking about that shed across the street and you keep seeing this guy walking out in the middle of the night. That's folk horror.
Yeah, like the telltale heart, for example. That's really kind of psychological, isn't it?
Yes, it's just getting claustrophobic.
hmm Yeah. Carl says, thank you. Okay. And we also have a question from Haley Moses.
That's
I'm
just
going to ask it. Haley says, does the genre of folk horror have any possible allusions to diplomatic solutions for social divisions, sexism, racism, and othering instead of violence?
that's my daughter, like in the room behind me.
Hi, Haley.
Smarty Pants and Magoo. Well, yeah, I think folk horror is a political lens. It has a political lens to it. You can see politics through a folk horror lens, which again is a warning. It's always a warning of the cohesiveness of people. So all those different things that she said there, they're if they're not feeling a part of the larger group, they become a subset into kind of a folk, an othered group, a group that is othered. So yeah,
Okay,
no
thank
food
you.
for you, Haley. No food for you.
That's a whole different kind of horror.
Yes.
All right, you mentioned Tolkien in your talk to us about your thesis. And I know how much you love Tolkien, as do I, as you know. So, what did you find of interest that would tie Tolkien and M.R. James? They seem so different on the surface.
They're not though. They're both
Mhm.
really stuffy English turn of the
You
century.
can't just say
I
stuffy.
have to say, and I didn't say Welsh. I didn't say Welsh, did I? I said English,
Now
right?
you said no, you just said stuffy. You
All
called
right. Well, whatever.
Tolkien
Well, whatever. They're
stuffy.
that same turn of the century.
Yeah.
The origin of the species has come out. The new
Mhm.
sciences have come out. Orthodoxy is being challenged, and there's anxiety about a worldview that's going to
Yeah,
hold.
yeah, that's it.
And then the war occurs, the Great War occurs, the First World War, but it's really a long one, right, to the Second World
Mm.
War, and trying to deal with the falling apart of ethics that we thought were for sure. So both Tolkien and M.R. James use their imagination to deal with their anxiety. You
Love
can
that. Yeah.
just dealing with their angst at what has become of this world, right? The other thing that I mentioned before is, but Tolkien's a wonderful landscape author as well. You know what I mean? When they leave the Shire, that's some of the best landscape narration there is.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't figure that out till even fairly recently, that it's the way he describes the journey and the sloping of the mountains and the hills that's beautiful. And
Mhm.
you read anything by Lewis and you totally lose that. You just completely lose that detail to nature and the walking outside. And M.R. James and Tolkien were both outside door people. You know,
Mhm.
they would both protect the environment today. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They
Oh, I
spent a
bet.
lot of time out there. So they were narrators of the environment, that they had that in common, that I noticed in reading M.R. James.
Yeah, yeah. For Tolkien, I don't know M.R. James as well as you do, but I know for Tolkien, the landscape is almost another character.
Yes. And that is a summation of folk horror. The landscape is the enemy. Like
Mhm.
it's it's not that werewolf. It's being in at Crystal Lake. That is the enemy. It's a region. So
hmm
yeah,
hmm Well, there's a nice sort of follow-up question here, then I think would be very interesting for you. Max is asking another question,
and that's
uh,
not fair. She already asked a question.
asking, on its surface, folk horror rejects this frightening, irrational backwardness. Is there any hint of nostalgia or desire for that earlier, possibly primitive time in James's writing?
Well, because the vernacular of the characters that are othered in his stories are from his childhood, and he loved his childhood.
hmm
There is some sort of Freudian thing in there, at least talking about James, of letting go or using it for other purposes, right? There certainly is the what you do with the desire for nostalgia, right? Which used to be said as a form of, it's an illness. To be nostalgic, they used to think was a form of an illness, because you preferred the past, which is no longer here, to the present and the challenges you have to go forward. So I would say definitely there is an ambivalence there. I mean, yeah, that's the folk horror messes with your understanding of ethics and morality, right? It says, well, there were people before you that had a different morality, and they're still there, and they're waiting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is it's a twisted thing. Yeah, it's not a black and white situation where one just says, um, um, in the ash tree, the woman who is taken as a witch, the upper class town in which she lives defends her. But at the end, she comes back from the dead as a witch and is a witch. And it's
Mm-hmm.
connected to the bottom of an ash tree, the roots of an ash tree. So you have this kind of love, you know, this, we don't want witches, and she's not one, but then she was playing for the other side the whole time. She was a witch, and you've become kind of bonded to, you know. So there is an ambivalence there. Yeah.
Interesting. Um, Robert Cathy has a question.
Um,
Robert asks another anthropological question. Does folk horror propose that human beings are mostly irrational animals with reason trying to guide the vast elephant of our passions?
the warning of folk horror is we may descend into that place
Mm-hmm.
where there is a confusion of what forward ethical progress is. Because we could go back 500 years and there's a certain, you know, we all look, you know, whatever. We look at the Goths or we look at all these different, we don't want those ethics happening now, but we can fall back into them. So I think definitely there is a sense of moral relativity that
Mm-hmm.
is in those stories, as far as you have to question whether you're on the right side of history or not, so to speak. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the illustration I have as an American is the South.
Mm-hmm.
It's the South, which continues a certain narrative, and we could fall back into it. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I happen to think there is well, MLK believed there's a moral arc, so I happen to think there's an arc. But yeah, that is definitely part of the sociological, anthropological part of folk horror, is that ambivalence,
Mm-hmm.
questioning what you think is the norm. And it doesn't answer it, just it's not the norm. Pet Cemetery is, this is the way the universe works. It's not like it doesn't, it does. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't say like we shouldn't do those things. It's just like watch out when you do them.
Okay, so to follow up on that, you would say that there are messages to modern readers in these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I have touched on that just a little bit, but in the United States, we have an othering of groups. We have a splitting apart of what we believe is moving forward or moving with people. And folk horror is very much a threat to our democracy
Mm-hmm.
and to our unity as human beings, right? Folk horror is, there's something, the warning is the horror is that we can't overcome it, right? That we cannot overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that guy with the horns and the mane that got into the chamber of the Senate or the House, I don't think he was right. I don't think that was the right thing to do. He's a prime candidate for a conjurer in a folk horror story, right? Of an alternative ethic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, and I don't know why, I'm a Presbyterian, so I'd say providentially, this thesis is sort of timely with the election coming up, and not just what happens at the election, but how we move forward from the election, because you've got pockets. When you get too many pockets of people with alternative understandings, you can't. It slows down unity and flourishing, I would say, is what we want.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point. A slightly more tongue-in-cheek question here from Carl Lemmel,
No.
who says, "What is scarier, the Fenstanton Witch at the end of a street or Michael Myers?"
Well, can I wait? Can you see behind me? Do you see Michael?
Oh, yes.
He is.
Yeah.
He is behind me. So, the fence. Michael. I have Michael Myers. Yeah, that would just be my answer. That's ominous and not folk horrorish. It's just very scary. So.
Mm-hmm. Carl says, all kidding aside, he's thoroughly enjoying the insight of this.
Carl's my third cousin. So we
So
always
he's
said in college, he was my roommate as well. We always said we could get married if we needed to because we were third cousins. So
okay, fair enough. At least it would be
that's the
relatively
backdrop to Carl Lemmel. Yeah.
okay. All right, so let's bring this back to your thesis. For every single one of my thesis students, kind of ever, there's always been stuff that they wanted to include in their thesis, but because there's a limit on how much you can put in a thesis, they had to leave stuff out, some things that they wanted to pursue but couldn't. Is there anything like that for you? Something that you would have loved to have included, but you, for the sake of space in the thesis, you couldn't do that?
Well, there was just all sorts of 15th century demonological tracts for reading at the time, and I've got a little occult itch that I like to read that stuff. And it just is endless as to the part of the Puritan part of the stories was this demonological fascination or fetish the Puritans had about the outside world. So there was a lot of that folklore that I would have loved to have gotten into more. I was really fascinated about, M.R. James. He's the son of a pastor, and his brother became a pastor, Church of England rector, excuse me. He was a rector. Why did he choose not to? You got all this ambivalence about modernity coming in there. And what were his views? Like you said, like what were his views? They seem to be ambivalent. His stories reveal that he's ambivalent about what he's living through. So I would have loved to get into that, although it'd be harder to do. And then he did all those apocryphal, pseudepigraphal legends of the New Testament that I would love to get into more as a New Testament scholar. And I have a degree in New Testament, so I can say that. But that was very interesting to me, to anybody who actually reads those old texts. And most of our nightmares are in those texts. They're in the Bible, but the really deep ones are in those texts that are very troubling, fanciful. So.
But you had to cut all of this out for the sake of
no. Well, I just said, he did this, he did that, and he was a pastor's kid or whatever. But there's a new biography coming out on M.R. James by Oxford University Press that hopefully will have a lot of this stuff more, at least the part of his psychology of his religious belonging in. Of course, and I'll just say this, but folks talk about whether M.R. James was gay. So that was a lot of the stuff of a lot of the descriptions of the ghosts and the bodies and how they. So there's a lot of rich study being done on some of those single men ghost story authors, as well as female authors as well, that chose to write this genre because they could not express themselves openly. So that's in there too. I would have loved to go down that one.
Sounds like a second thesis.
I don't want to say no, thank you, but anyway.
But you got to say no, thank you.
Yeah, we'll get to the end of we'll survive the next 4 minutes, and we'll talk about it. All right.
Fair enough. Okay, to wrap this up, you've now come to the end of your entire master's journey, but as for every master's student, the really big hurdle is the thesis at the end. And as always at Signum, we've got people who are about to start their thesis, who are just starting their thesis, who are thinking about starting in the next semester or so. Do you have any advice you would give them? Things that you wish you had known before you had started your thesis work?
Well, I knew when I did the thesis, McCartney said, don't ever go on the road with songs you don't like, right? So you got to pick something that you really love because you're going to just completely obsess on it. So, I mean, I think everyone knows that, but that's really important at the get-go to get an area that you're not just interested in, but you really kind of love or obsess on in some way inside of you. I got to tell you, part of this thesis writing was me being at a shout out to Montreat camp there. I was at a camp for 2 weeks this summer. And every day I got up and went and wrote. And I did not have a discipline of writing. I don't know how I would have ever gotten this done if I wasn't isolated somewhere and all I had was the computer and the notes I had, because it really made me dig in a serious way.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know, most people are smart and do that anyways, but that was really key for me,
So
is to
finding space for yourself.
finding time to write, to find
Hmm.
like hours a day, that it's difficult to find, but for me, I was able to find it, and it was like it was miraculous in that way. But yeah, finding a rhythm for writing is really important.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Any other advice?
Is this where I'm supposed to plug Signum?
Oh, no, no, not at
Why
all.
wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you study speculative literature at
Mhm.
Signum University? It's unbelievably awesome.
No
Um,
arguments for me.
I had folks who helped me along the way. I had students. Kira is on here, I'm sure somehow, but folks who helped me along the way, that just encouraged me. And I guess I should just say that you should have people in your life who care about you. I would not be in this program. I would not have finished without you, Professor Brown, who pulled me out of the ditch, and Kira as well. Sat down with me more than once and was just encouraging for months, if not a year, over a year. So people that are supportive of you.
Hmm.
I would never, sorry, I wouldn't be here. So I give all praise to you,
Oh.
mighty Welsh queen.
Ah, diolch yn fawr.
Yeah.
We all need the folks around us who give us support. Actually, that's incredibly important. Even if their support is just giving you space, that can be an incredibly important thing just in and of itself. But we have come to the end, not just of this Thesis Theatre, Jay, but of your entire Signum Masters journey. You're done. Ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, Jay Moses has passed his master's degree. Congratulations, Jay. I am absolutely delighted for you. I'm really, really pleased for you. Congratulations. You shall be graduating next summer. How wonderful.
Wonderful. It's a huge,
Well,
huge accomplishment. I'm very proud.
you should be very proud. It is a massive accomplishment. Nobody gets this far without having put in a great deal of effort, a great deal of work, a lot of commitment, and a heck of a lot of time. So, and blood, sweat, and tears often along the way,
Yeah.
right? Yes. So you'll see in the chat lots of people saying congratulations and hooray and yay. Everybody delighted for you. And I want to thank everybody who has come to this Thesis Theatre to support Jay, to ask questions that made him squirm on his seat, because that was fun
Better
to watch.
believe that. Yeah.
Just just to be here to mark this final point in somebody's thesis journey and master's journey. It really is great to have people here to do that. So thank you all. I'm glad that you were all here with me. Jay, thank you for a very fun time, actually. I always enjoy working with you. You know that, I hope. And
I do. We're friends.
yes, we are. I hope
And
it will
colleagues.
always be
Yes.
so.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. See you again at a future Thesis Theatre. See you at graduation.
I know. I'll see you. Professor Brown. See you, everybody. Thanks for showing up.
Thank you, everyone. Bye now.